Riveting stuff here, I know. Welcome to the live stream. We're going to get started on the live recording of episode 3 of From the Archives, the short podcast. But normally, before I start recording, or rather, before I start actually jumping into the scripted stuff, I usually just hang out here for a few moments, just to let people show up to the chat so I don't start on exactly at 11. This is sort of the, as you would say in, I guess, comedian circles, the warm-up. I'm not really doing any comedy right now. But sort of the, milling about phase before we start in with the scripted stuff, because I don't want to just jump straight in like a television program at 11 a.m. But just some highlights, some things, sort of some backstage stuff. What I did with last week's episode. Before I start, I need to go grab last week's book and show you what it looks like now, because I said I was going to can it. So I should show you what's left of it. So be right back. Andy's back. So this is what's left of last week's book, Who Pays? So not really much left of this book. I decided to keep the front covers, and I also decided to keep, like 4 pages here, and it's just comics on them. So I don't know what I'm going to do with these comics yet. I might turn them into fun art. I might hang them up. I might put them on a frame or something. But I thought the artwork was neat enough. I decided to keep that. Then I ended up recycling the rest of the book. I guess that's just what ended up happening from last week's episode. So I'll probably talk about that in this week's episode. Other sort of housekeeping update things that I thought were useful to mention is, obviously, I added a theme song to the podcast. I also did a little bit more editing than I did in the first episode, just because I didn't know what it was going to be like having to edit a podcast and, what goes into the production of those things. I'm obviously not doing any video editing when I upload to the YouTube channel, so all of this just gets thrown into the YouTube channel. But that's mostly because of my other obligations. I don't really have the luxury of video editing, which requires a little bit more attention and focus than if I was just editing audio, because with editing audio, it's just, rearranging things, turn it into a FLAC file, and then upload to SoundCloud. Super easy for me. I don't have to worry about visuals or anything like that. So uploading audio, much, much easier than uploading video. Wow, that took me a moment to figure out. But we're going to get started here probably in a few minutes here on the actual scripted stuff for the podcast. But I just wanted to update you guys on a few of those housekeeping things. So I'll probably, I might make it a regular segment on the podcast talking about what happened to the other books, especially when they have such a drastic change from week to week. I mean, that's all that's left of Who Pays. 4 pages and then the front covers. So we'll probably have a segment added to that, as long as it doesn't put us too far over the 20-minute mark. I really like having 20 minutes as the length of this podcast, and I also kind of like this little warm-up period before I jump into it. That way I can sort of gauge how the chat's doing, gives people time to trickle in. It also gives me time to sort of get acclimated, since I'm not used to being in front of the camera as often. For sort of scripted things, gives me a chance to sort of warm up to the camera myself as well, especially when you're working. Sorry, I'm showing you this as if it means anything to you. Especially when you're drafting research proposals, literally seconds before you go live, and so your mind has to shift gears from whatever you're working on for a project to, hey, we got to do this podcast now. So it's, scatterbrained, getting sent all over the place. All right, so we're going to get started here with this week's episode. So as usual, for those of you who are just joining, usually what happens is the first 5 to 10 minutes of the live stream, I kind of ramble on, give you some newsletter style updates on how the podcast has changed, any updates and that sort of thing. And then we're going to jump into sort of the scripted intro and then what I've got to talk about. And then there's sort of the option to post questions and whatnot. Although each week it just depends on how many people show up and ask questions. Otherwise, I'll just breeze through the scripted stuff that I have and talk about the books on this week's episode. So without further ado, I'm going to... Last week I made the mistake of saying I'm going to start recording, and I've decided since then that I just am going to download the episodes from my Twitch channel and then from there edit them. That way I don't have to consciously think about hitting record, turning off record on OBS Studios, all that kind of fun stuff. I just go straight into it. And then I can worry about that later in the editing room. So without further ado, let's get started with the podcast. Hello and welcome to From the Archives, a short podcast where I talk about a book from my library, why I have it, and whether you should or shouldn't read it. I'm Eric, a professor of anthropology at Cuyahoga Community College, and welcome to my library. The books in my library are sometimes old, sometimes rare, sometimes normal, but always interesting. This podcast is recorded live on Twitch at Anthropology Archives every Thursday at 11 a.m. Eastern. That's Anthropology Archives, lowercase, all one word. During live recordings, I promise to read all questions and comments from the chat in a different voice or accent to make it sound like someone else is talking or asking those questions or comments. Don't worry, if you've missed the live stream, you can listen to old episodes on my SoundCloud at Anthropology Archives. And you can also not just listen, but you can also watch old episodes on my YouTube channel of the same name in case you want to see some of the cover art that we talk about. If there's any graphics like drawings or pictures or cartoons or that kind of stuff, you can watch them on the YouTube channel. Every episode, I ask myself the following questions. How did I get this book? Have I read it? What are other people saying about it? Should you read it? And whether I should can it or keep it. With that said, let's pull a book from the shelf. Or rather, a few books. All right, so today we're talking about Chinatown, the Economic Adaptation and Ethnic Identity of the Chinese by Bernard Wong. This was published in 1982. It's a very short book. It's not very thick. It's about... Actually, let's get the ruler out. We can actually tell you how thin it is. We're talking about less than 5 millimeters here, or for those people who use English units, we're talking about less than a quarter inch in thickness here. Very, very thin book. But before I really dive into what this book is all about, you can probably presume, based on the cover, which shows you Manhattan's Chinatown, you can presume it's about the Manhattan Chinatown. But before I jump into it, I wanted to talk a little bit about how I got this book. And I know it seems kind of silly to talk about or have a segment on a podcast about book reviews to explain how I got the books, but suffice to say the books on my bookshelf, most of them did not come from me just going into a Barnes & Noble and just buying them. A lot of them were acquired with interesting and unusual methods, like the books. I have a whole rare books section or old books section. Those were not acquired at a Barnes & Noble kind of thing. So sometimes there's an interesting story to how the books were acquired. And oftentimes I want to give shout outs to small local bookstores, if I did get them at a small local bookstore, just because obviously support local small business. But in this case, I did not get this book from a local bookstore or a small business. I actually got this book from the Department of Anthropology at Ball State University. That's why on the spine here, it has the catalog information. So that's actually the Ball State Department of Anthropology catalog system. And they ended up deciding to purge this from their collections And when they did so, I decided to scoop it right up because they just put it in a bin saying free books, and I said, yes, please. And then that's when I found out on the front it says it's Eric Lassiter's books, and so he was a professor of anthropology at Ball State before he went to Marshall University. So that's the little history of how this book ended up in my library. But what I find interesting is why they would purge this from their collections, because this book is really part of a series, and it's a really interesting and insightful anthropological series. It's from what's called the Case Studies in Cultural Anthropology by George and Louise Spindler. So a little context on them. George Spindler was an anthropology professor at Stanford out in California from 1951 to 1978. And during that time, he actually was able to cajole and convince, I guess you could say, a bunch of anthropologists, contemporaries of his, to turn their ethnographies into these short little, roughly 100-page condensed versions, sort of like a Reader's Digest, but for ethnographic field studies of the time. And they made them in a way and edited them so that the public could go out and pick them up on the bookshelf and make them super easy reads. Just because, for comparison, a book I'm working on right now, reading, that we'll eventually review on the podcast, is Oscar Lewis's La Vida, which was published in 1966. And, I mean, this thing is thick. This thing is like 600 plus pages, and it is very detailed. Also about immigrant families in New York, but this case it's about Puerto Rican immigrant families as opposed to Chinese. But you can imagine just hearing the thud of that book versus the very different sounds between the two books there. You can imagine not everyone's going to be pulling La Vida off the shelf versus, say, this Chinatown book by Bernard Wong, at least in terms of reading an ethnography. So the other thing I'm going to mention about the case studies in anthropology and why they're so, I think, so interesting is because they're sort of these snapshots of ethnographies, and they're a good way to get your feet wet into ethnographies. They also have they have another series called Studies in Anthropological Method, also by the Spindlers. And most of these, as far as I could tell, most of these came out in the 60s and 70s and then into the 80s. Obviously, the one we're talking about today is from 82. But as far as I could tell, I could only find one website that had a complete list of the case studies in cultural anthropology, and there were 58 of them. And then I couldn't find a complete list of the studies in anthropological method. So I only have 2 copies of that series, or not that series, but 2 books in that series, I should say. And they distinguished them with these really fun logos. So you can't really see it that well if you're watching the video, but I'll describe it to those who are listening in. The case studies in cultural anthropology, I highly recommend you Google it or look it up. That logo is really cool, at least in my opinion. It looks sort of like a Deathly Hallows, Harry Potter sort of triangle with the line and the circles. It looks kind of like a teepee with 2 circles on either sides of it. Definitely, if you were getting a tattoo, I would think that this is a pretty sweet design to get. And then the one for the studies in anthropological method, not as cool in my opinion, but still pretty neat logo nonetheless to distinguish the 2 series that the Spindlers put out. And you can also see from you can't see if you're listening in, but there's also these 2 are about 100 pages apiece, surveying and mapping a manual of simplified techniques and using historical sources in anthropology and sociology. Gee, these titles just sound so enticing, don't they? But really, today's book I thought was pretty interesting. And not just because I knew next to nothing about Chinatown, but because of the way it was written. So when you're dealing with ethnographies, you can get a wide range. There's no like format to how an ethnography can be written. And in the case of Chinatown, it's more of a historical descriptive and summary style. And that's probably due in part because it's a condensed reader. It's not meant to be, La Vida. It's not meant to be a 600-page ethnography of Chinatown. Bernard Wong did write something to that effect. I mean, he did his PhD, I'm pretty sure, on Chinatown. And so he has much more he could say, but he's trying to condense it down to about 100 pages. So that's probably why it gives it that sort of historical descriptive feel. But that's just one way of writing a podcast. You can also, or not writing a podcast, oh my gosh, writing an ethnography. You can also have people write them more like fiction, taking fictionalized characters based on real people that they did ethnographic field work with. So a good example of that would be Zora Neale Hurston. She did a lot of field work in Central Florida, and then she ended up writing fictionalized versions of them in things like Their Eyes Were Watching God, which is technically based on her field work in, I believe, oh boy, I should have looked up the name of this town. It's a town just north of Orlando. Eatonville, that's what it is, Eatonville. But that's just those are just examples of the wide range of things. They can be cut and dry and very boring if they're just talking about minute details, but they can also be sort of a novel, and they can be entertaining to read. I would say that Chinatown falls more on the side of descriptive, can get into a bit of minute details, which can make it a relatively easy read, relatively quick read. I mean, it took me probably 2 weeks to read this 100-page book, but that's just because I kept getting interrupted by other things, and that's just more my reading style. I just am not able to sit down. I mean, my wife is able to sit down and read a book like cover to cover kind of thing, but for me, I have to read it in bites, just because there's so many other things that I want to do during the day that I can't ever feel justified in sitting down and reading a book cover to cover, which is ironic for someone doing book reviews on a podcast. But that being said, one of the things that I found striking about this is its sort of in-depth discussion of the history of immigration, particularly with Chinese, go figure. And I already had a general understanding of how immigration policies had developed in the United States over time, because I have to teach them in class. I talk about the 1965 Immigration Act, talk about the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, the Citizenship Act of 1924. I think there's another one in 1929. So I had like the broad brushstrokes, like here's the beats of immigration history in the United States. But what I found interesting is how deep of a dive Wong got into sort of how the Immigration Act of 1965 really changed the dynamics of Chinatown. The most striking, I think, fact that I got out of this book, or one of the biggest takeaways that I'll keep with me from this book, and I bookmarked it because of how surprising it was, is he starts talking about, like I said, that difference between 1965 before and after the Immigration Act. And here he's saying, according to the Bureau of Census Statistics, out of 909 Chinese in New York State in 1880, only 12 were women. By 1890, when the Chinese population in New York State had increased to 2,935, only 33 were female. For instance, in 1940, the sex ratio between Chinese male and female was almost 6-1. So it's really interesting, not knowing much about Chinatown. This totally changed my perception of historical Chinatown, in the sense of how few women and children there were in Chinatown before 1965, and how much the policy of discrimination of U.S. immigration policy was that not only did they not want Chinese people in the United States, they wouldn't even let their wives or their children come in, because they didn't want families to take root in the United States, because the idea was Chinese immigrants in Chinatown in either New York or San Francisco or all these other Chinatowns, which Wong briefly mentions. Like, I was surprised that there was a Chinatown in El Paso. Wasn't expecting that. But what's striking is that these Chinese immigrants pre-1965, they weren't intending to stay in the United States. They wanted to return to China, and they were just in the United States to support their families. And so I find that an interesting fact to take away from this book. It's not the only fact. That should not be the one takeaway from this book. There are many other takeaways from this book, but that one was the one that stuck out the most to me. And there are all sorts of other interesting facts inside this book. But this was written in 1982. Sorry, I'm just checking the time here. This was written in 1982, and so I felt the need to do a little bit more research to find out how things have changed and the past 40 years, especially with the Lower Manhattan Chinatown that Wong spends most of his time talking about. What I learned is that the Manhattan Chinatown is not even the only Chinatown, at least according to Stephanie Tudor of The Eater, a New York, I guess, like dining magazine or blog site. There are 9 different Chinatowns in New York, in the boroughs. But there are 2 other big ones in addition to the one that probably most of us are familiar with, the Manhattan Chinatown. There's also one in Flushing, Queens, and then there's also one in Sunset Park, Brooklyn. And what's interesting is the Manhattan Chinatown, since the 80s, has been on the decline in population, while the one in Flushing and Sunset, Sunset Park is what I said? Yeah, Sunset Park, Brooklyn, have been increasing in population and size. What's interesting when I was doing research on these other Chinatowns is that most of the writing about them was about good places to eat. And I felt like that was a major through line of this ethnography, or rather this book, I should say, is food and tourism are a big part of the Chinatown economy. But what I found surprising was that this was written in 82, and in 1978, Edward Said, a Palestinian anthropologist, wrote the book Orientalism, which is essentially, I mean, if I had to define Orientalism in a brief, broad brushstroke, it's fetishizing otherness and romanticization of the East as this exotic land. That's Orientalism in a nutshell, condensing Said's book really quickly there. I could definitely see how pre-1965 Chinatown was looked at more as a scary place, based on how Wong is describing it with the triads, the Tong, the Tong clan sort of running most of Chinatown. But post-1965, I can definitely see as families become more prominent in Chinatown, you see a leaning into sort of this ethnic authenticity, the idea of selling sort of touristy shops, people coming to Chinatown to eat what is, quote, authentic Chinese food. This sort of peddling of otherness as a means of economic opportunity. And so I was sort of surprised that Wong doesn't even give airspace to Said's Orientalism. But I guess, 1982, Wong was probably writing about Chinatown. He spent most of the 70s doing research in Chinatown, so he might have been a little bit preoccupied to notice a new book coming out about this concept that how is he to know in 1978 that this is going to be, a groundswell anthropological text for people to read. Sorry, my thoughts were all over the place there. But I guess that kind of leads into, obviously, to sort of backtrack there, have I read it? Yes, that should go without saying. We've already talked about why I have it, but now we need to talk about what other people are saying about it. And I'm starting to notice and sense a pattern in the types of books on my bookshelf, which is why for the intro to this podcast, I decided to add the sometimes rare, sometimes old, sometimes normal, because a lot of these books I'm finding don't have reviews, or if they do, they are few and far between, and you really got to hunt for those reviews. I couldn't find any written reviews for Bernard Wong's book. I thought, based on last week's episode with Who Pays, the New York Times having a book review for it, I thought maybe I'll strike it with the New York Times archives again. Considering it is a book about Manhattan's Chinatown, you would think the New York Times would maybe want to do a book review about this book, since it's geared towards the general public, talking about a neighborhood in their city. But nowhere in the New York Times archive is there discussion of Wong's book. And the only ratings I could find, I could see it listed on Goodreads, but nobody had rated it. I mean, they couldn't even get the cover art on the page. So that shows you how popular this book has been since 1982. But I did find on the website Library Thing, which is where I got the list of case studies in cultural anthropology, one person had rated it 4.5 stars. Now, if I were to rate this book, I would probably have to give it 2 separate ratings, and I feel like this would be just how I'm going to rate books on this podcast from here on out, is sort of a rating for the general public and then a rating for anthropologists. Because I feel like an anthropologist might give it a higher rating because this is in their repertoire of books that they might read. Whereas people in the general public, it's like, well, unless you plan on becoming an anthropologist, you probably don't want to or need to read books in certain genres. So I would say for the general public, I'd probably say Chinatown is a 3 out of 5. It's certainly not the best ethnography. It's okay. It's a solid 3 out of 5. I wouldn't go so far as to say it's middling 2.5. It's certainly a good insight into immigration policy because a lot of the patterns I saw in this book about Chinatown, you could directly apply to, say, the other book that I'm working through right now, La Vida, about Puerto Ricans. You could say the same about indigenous populations in the U.S. and the struggles that they've gone through. So it's a similar sort of story of immigration of people of color in the United States. Obviously, it's different case to case, but I certainly think it's a good introductory ethnography if you want to check it out. It's only 100 pages. I feel like if you're more dedicated than I am and you read more methodically than I do, you could probably read this cover to cover in a day. Like if you had a Saturday, you could wake up, start this, finish it, and have dinner. So it's pretty accessible in that regard compared to a lot of other ethnographies that I've read, but it can be pretty dry at points with some stats and whatnot that's not super interesting. So like I said, not the best ethnography out there, but you can certainly do worse. Now, if you're an anthropologist, I'd probably give this a 4 out of 5, precisely for similar reasons, like super easy to get your hands on, super easy to read. So why not just throw it into your collective knowledge of ethnographic fieldwork? So I guess the last part we need to talk about is, am I canning it or am I keeping it? I think what I'm going to decide to do is I'm going to donate this. I'm going to can it. So I'm not going to can it like I did last week. So last week's book, Who Pays, we decided to can it. And that one, I felt like it was just going to the recycling bin. So what I ended up doing is cutting it up and keeping the cover art, the book cover, I should say, with the fun designs, keeping a few of the cartoons, like the one with the Wizard of Oz characters. I cut those pages out, kept them. Haven't figured out what I'm going to do with them yet. Maybe make some collages or send them out to listeners. But I think what I'll do with Chinatown is I'll either donate this to a library, maybe donate it to a listener. I'm thinking about that maybe in the long run as these episodes go on, probably doing listener giveaways. So books that I'm going to purge from my library, maybe another person can read it and maybe turn it into sort of like a book club thing where, I give it to a reader and that reader can either keep it or give it to another person to read, that sort of thing. But I feel like this kind of book, because I'm not someone who researches, immigration, I'm not an anthropologist who studies policy or Chinatown or anything like that. It's not really in my wheelhouse. Now that I've read it once, I don't really have any utility in going back to it since there's not really any data that I might be drawing from. So I think it might be better served giving it to someone else to read. So that's the verdict on Chinatown. We are canning it in the donate pile. So I know that doesn't fit the nice thematic kitschy rhyme I came up with, but there you have it. I haven't figured out what I'm going to do for next week's episode. I think I'm probably going to do something similar, like a historical or an ethnography book of that sort. But we'll see. We're certainly not going to do La Vida. I've still got 500 plus pages of that book to get through. So this is a beast of a book. But we are getting through it. So that's going to do it for today's episode. Remember to check out the Telegram channel if you want to stay up to date on other things that are happening. I post regular announcements about other projects that you can get involved with, posting upcoming episode sneak peeks and previews. And remember to check out SoundCloud to listen to the edited version of the podcast, and also check out the YouTube channel and tune in to Twitch every Thursday at 11 to join in on the live stream, live recording. And until then, never stop reading.